we'll go through them. I know at least a couple of questions that are on their way. Thanks for coming in. It's a warm day. It's a warm day outside there. We should all be watching cricket, shouldn't we? But we've got 77 of us at the moment, plus a few more actually, because some of you are sitting there in twos and threes. So perhaps we'll get up nearer to 100 by the time we've finished. So Vic, a big welcome to you. I hope
Hello, Nigel.
you see you there on the screen. I'm sure they'd rather look at you than me. A big welcome. It's great to see you back. Perhaps a few people online haven't seen you if they don't come to Cricket Society meetings. They don't see you on television very often. I think so. This is Vic Marks, our esteemed Vice President, and so much more. Many of us have greatly enjoyed in the last week or so hearing you on Test Match Special, and yesterday at Southampton, where I think you are now on the ODI. I thought you were very good. He said, I mean, and I mean that, a nice touch of experience, gravitas. I thought you brought to the proceedings. Perhaps you benefited from rotation, like Stuart Broad. I find myself.
Well, in which case, like Stuart Broad, I don't really like rotation much. I want to do it all.
I know you're in a hotel in Southampton where you were yesterday. You've been home since you were in Manchester. You don't have a dog, but you've been home presumably to see Anna in Exeter and catch up on your work, etc. There, could you tell us a bit about where you are now, what it's like there?
Well, I'm not in Southampton. I am at the AGS Bowl, and my window is just that way, and beyond that is the square. So I'm at the Hilton at one end, opposite the pavilion at the AGS Bowl. I'm about 20 yards from where TMS are broadcasting. They're just down the corridor, 20 yards that way, in a converted hotel bedroom. And in between stints, because of the social distancing, I come back to my room and I rest up lying on my bed until it's my next stint.
Right.
And there was a similar arrangement, although we had to walk up at Old Trafford. We had to walk at least 100 yards from our on-site hotel round to the other end of the ground to go to the broadcasting area. So I'm in my second bubble of the summer.
Right.
And it's a weird thing to experience first off. I mean, when I turned up at Old Trafford, my heart sank. There was endless tests, temperature tests. I got given accreditation, but I also got given a tag, which tells them exactly where I am at any time during the day, if I'm still on site, who I've been associating with, just in case someone gets infected or I get infected. Socially distanced dining. It's a whole new world. But of course, after about a day, everyone gets used to it and soldiers on. Not as before, but you just get used to it. But it is bizarre.
Yeah.
And as I say, here yesterday, especially for a one-day match, lovely cloudless skies, and not a soul in the stands except for the odd photographer and maybe the odd member of the ground staff.
Yeah.
Still, it's better than nothing.
As a writer and journalist, you've tended, and you make this clear in your book, that you concentrate on the match rather than what's going on around it, and Guardian or other colleagues sometimes feed you information. I'm just wondering where you are now. It's a very intimate atmosphere, isn't it? You're closer to the players, you're closer to your fellow journalists. Is that at all affecting the way you look at the game, the way you commentate, the way you write?
Well, as far as we are physically quite close to the players, but we never actually have any contact with them whatsoever. We are in a separate bubble. So we don't see the players. And if you get the odd broadcaster can interview them from a distance of about 10 feet. But for the written press, who aren't in such a sort of tight bubble, they do all their press conferences on Zoom. There are only 12 written journalists permitted at test matches. But as I say, they've got a very pathetic little bubble in that they come in, every day. They stay in normal hotels. They can go to the pub in the evening, or they could do anyway when they were in Manchester. Whether they'll be able to do that in the next test, I doubt, actually. So they are in such a stringent bubble. But the broadcasters, whether radio, TV, or the employees of the ECB, are in the tighter bubble. So that when I was at Old Trafford, you're not allowed to leave the stadium for 5 days. Likewise here, we've got 2 spare days, and I was sort of assuming I could pop home again, but no, I've got to stay inside this little bubble until the final match on Tuesday. So I'm not sure it makes a great deal of difference. I covered the first 2 tests for the Guardian from my sofa at home, and I'm not necessarily sure that the pieces I wrote were diminished by that. In fact, if you're watching on television all day and you stay awake, which is not always easy when Sibley gets stuck in, I find that you actually probably watch more carefully than when you are at the ground, because if you're there writing or broadcasting, certainly broadcasting, you are watching quite closely during the half an hour you're on air. But then after that, usually you're busying yourself around the back, chatting to someone you haven't seen for a while, or doing other things and just keeping half an eye on what's going on. Whereas in front of the television, if you're awake, you have a very good view of what's going on. So it might impact how journalism works, I suspect, not necessarily for the better, but the offices, they won't see any difference, I don't think, in most people's copy as to whether they are actually at the ground or sitting on their sofa.
Mm, mm. During one of the tests where I think you weren't commentating, there were very powerful personal testimonies from Ebony Rainford Brent and Mikey Holding. Did you watch those, and what was your reaction to that?
Well, it was on the very first day of the series, actually, and I duly switched on, eager to watch some Test cricket, and it was, in a sense, all incredibly fortuitous, in that it rained and it was wet, and as most of you will have probably seen, or some of you, Sky then broadcast something that they'd filmed previously with Michael and Ebony, and you suddenly realize that this was not just an ordinary time filler. This was really very significant stuff, very passionate, and you were struck by the depth of feeling from Michael, who was so coherent, and indeed Ebony. And then after that must have gone on for about, I guess, 20 minutes, half an hour, and then it was still raining. So they went for some live interviews with Michael, especially, and he was still on the front foot, very coherent, very powerful, talking about, actually, I remember all sorts of stuff, but what I wasn't aware of, he was talking about a certain sort of racism within his own family, and the fact that one of his parents was much blacker than his other, and on the light side of the family, they really looked down on I think it was his father, because he was so much blacker than his mother. I mean, this was all stunning stuff. So it had a big impact, and I think it had a big impact on lots of people who were watching. I mean, I'm not a big social media man, but it was trending all over the place. And as I say, it was one of the few occasions where rain stopping play was probably a virtuous thing.
Mm. Do you think it'll lead to any significant change, perhaps in the pathways to the England team?
Well, it may do. I mean, it's an oddity, isn't it? There are, of course, three Asian players in this one-day side. There was a phase about 25 years ago where there were far more black cricketers in the England setup within county cricket than there are now. I don't know quite why that's become less prevalent. It might be that a lot more are going off to play football, but one hopes so. I mean, we all sit back comfortably and say, well, none of us are really racist at all, but it is very hard for us to understand that sort of silent racism that these people have experienced, that Michael talked about or Ebony talked about. and one hopes, I'm sure theoretically the ECB are trying to encourage more from the Asian African community or ex-African community to get to. There was a spot actually about 10 or 15 years ago, and I thought at the time this was a very healthy sign, when the England team was captained by Nasser Hussain, the Lions team was captained by Mark Lane, and the under-19 team was captained by, I think it was Bilal Shafayat at the time. And I thought the great thing about that at the time, I was thinking, was that no one's made mention of this. This seems to be just how it is, you know. But maybe that was a bit naive back then, thinking like that. Anyway, it's had a huge impact, I think. And it was odd, actually, here, before the start of yesterday's game, all the players at about 1 minute to 2 on the field took the knee. As did all of us in the commentary box, which included Michael Carberry and Tymal Mills. So that was quite striking too, although no one here to witness it really, but I'm sure people watching did.
We heard it. It was described on Test Match Special yesterday afternoon. Thanks for that. And you've written a lot about the recent West Indies tour. Your views that it was the rotation that helped them, and that perhaps over time the West Indian batsmen found it harder to cope with more traditional English conditions, carefully exploited, etc. And you've mentioned probably the bubble as a factor. You're now in the middle of, and members may have come back with questions about that. You're now in the middle of the ODIs, which looks a longer game. You had less downtime yesterday than perhaps you thought you would at one time. We've got the Pakistan series starting almost soon, next week, isn't it? The last 5 Test series England have played, they've lost the first Test match, and they've only won 2. They've won 2 of the 5 series, the last 2. The previous one, 2-2 draw against Australia, it was a loss, the first one. They lost 1-0 in India. They lost in the Caribbean a while back. So that's 5 tests. I just wonder how the first test of the next series might go.
Well, one would hope that they should be an advantage, England, in that whilst Pakistan have been here for 3 or 4 weeks now, and like the West Indies, I'm sure they've relished the opportunity to practice in English conditions on the county grounds around the place. But England have had 3 toughish Test matches, so they are in the groove. So you would think that should not apply this time around. I don't know. Sometimes I think at the start of the series, England have been a bit funky. You've got more time to theorise before you get going again. And so usually in recent times, it coincides with leaving out Stuart Broad and then subsequently losing, and then Broad is returned. Most obviously in the Caribbean last time. It still surprises me to see the side we picked in Barbados, where I think the attack was Curran, Stokes, presumably Anderson, Moeen, and Rashid. Of course, that's the match in which West Indies got about 700 in their second innings, or 600, or set England 620 to win, and they, against the odds, they lost comfortably. So I think there's an element of sometimes over-theorising and maybe even, complacency of thinking, well, we'll try this funky new team balance and that'll work. Maybe in South Africa, to be fair, they had all sorts of stuff going on. Half the team were ill. They were overrun by that bug. So I'm not sure we can take too much from that. Theoretically, against Pakistan, none of that should apply. They're quite match hardened. The good thing is, I think, that all 6 of their pace bowlers have played 1 game at least. So they are in the groove. You could pick them with some confidence that they're going to be on target and on top of their form. And I'm sure there won't be many changes in the batting lineup. So England have got no excuse for not being battle hardened against Pakistan. I think Pakistan have posed quite a threat. They're another team with potentially a very good bowling lineup. So they should break that sequence perhaps at Old Trafford next week.
Thank you for that. Can we move on to your own Test and first class career back in the last century, I think it was. And can I take you briefly back to one of the shortest little speeches I've ever heard you make? It was in late 2018 in Colombo, a very warm day, a bit like today. You brought a few cans of beer over, I seem to remember. Moonlit beach at Lavinia. You joined our Cricket Society tourists for a pre-test dinner, and you were going to speak, but then suddenly we had a special guest, Muralitharan, and you introduced him by famously pointing out that you got 811 Test wickets between you, and then you sat down. It was a great great evening.
So, well, Murali was fantastic anyway, and I was very keen to sit down. But yes, I think I told the audience how privileged they were to have 811 Test wickets staring at them.
Yeah. Now then,
and I left them with a man with 800.
A little question for you. You're a vice president of the Cricket Society, among much else, but you're not the only Test player on Johnny Barclay's presidential team. Do you know the combined Test total for the Test playing members of the Cricket Society team?
Well, Deadly. You're talking about Deadly, aren't you? Are you Derek Underwood?
Yes, you could say that. Yes.
Well, I know that he's just short of 300.
That's Derek. Right. 297. So there's 300 and a bit over
308. The fact is, I've only got 11 to my name.
Yeah. However, sorry, it was a trick question because.
Oh, is there another one?
Charlotte Edwards has also.
Has she got a wicket?
She's got 12 Test wickets.
Oh, I beg your pardon.
So the answer is
more than me.
320. More than you, yeah, 320, but a lot more than the 811 that you shared with Murali. Okay, an easy question next time. 14th to the 16th of June, 1985. Do you remember where you were?
Oh, I think I probably do. If I'm reading your mind. I think I might have been in Bath.
You were. You were. And you took there your best figures of 8 for 17 against
yes, it was. Yes, I did. I got 8 for 17 against Lancashire.
What do you remember?
I don't want to belittle this feat, but there were one or two extenuating circumstances. We used to go to Bath for the Bath Festival, play on the rec there next to the rugby ground. No other cricket matches would be played on that square throughout the summer. It was a cricket venue created purely for that festival. So there were quite a few logistical problems for Somerset to get it ready, not least getting the square ready. And I'm pretty sure that year they had sent missives about putting fertilizer on the square before we got up there and before they started putting up the tents and getting everything organized beyond the boundary. And I think whoever was charged with this mistakenly put weed killer on the square rather than fertilizer. Well, there's a lot of weeds on that square at the best of times. And then I think it may have rained, so we might have played on the same pitch for 6 days. I don't know, but it did spin. All I can tell you, it did spin. And I kept bowling Lancashire out in the second innings. It was our own, and sadly, it was our only victory of what was a pretty horrendous summer. The other bit that I cherish more than anything, this is quite a long story, but I'm going to tell it now because no one can stop me. The previous winter, I toured with England to India in a very close-knit tour because of Mrs. Gandhi's assassination. There were assassinations of Deputy British High Commissioner. So press and players got very close, stayed in the same hotels, unusually travelled in the same buses to the ground, frequented the same bars. And we all got on extremely well, partly because we were thrown into this strange situation. And as the really eagle-eyed amongst you will know, I wrote a tour book about it called Marks Out of 11. And at the start of one chapter, I explained to my reader how important it was on a tour like that your wives came out, if possible, to join the tour for a week or two. And whilst doing this, I quoted the great John Woodcock, who said something like, who'd written beforehand, something like, wives are no more appropriate on a cricket tour than they would have been in the trenches of the Somme. Well, I thought this was a bit rich, so I quoted John and saying that actually, even though he's John Woodcock, I don't agree with this viewpoint. Anyway, sorry to labour, but I get 8 for 17 the following summer during, I think, the Headingley test. And they were so stunned in the press box at Headingley that they rather sweetly, they got together a card, or a big postcard, sending their congratulations and probably mentioning their astonishment that down in Taunton, I got 8 for 17. And then I recognised John Woodcock's hand, and all he'd written was Anna there, he said, which is my wife. Anyway, I don't quite know if that interests, but how did we get to that? I can't remember, but
well, we're talking about your best
1985, I suppose.
Your best figures, and you went back to 1984, which in fact was your best year in cricket, wasn't it? And in lots of
I scored a lot of runs in 1984.
I'll tell you how many. You scored 1,197 runs at 54.40, ahead of Crowe, Botham, and Roebuck playing for Somerset. You were the top Somerset wicket taker with 78, and high in the national averages with 86 victims overall. And you got 3 centuries in August.
I know. I got 5 centuries in my career, which shows that something went wrong somewhere along the way. I don't know why. One factor I can tell you was that the West Indies were touring, which obviously made batting an easier process in county cricket, because suddenly there was no Malcolm Marshall down at Hampshire. Michael Holding was nowhere to be seen, etc. A non-West Indies county side made life easier for batsmen. And other than that, I can't remember. I know I bowled a lot. Ian was away playing for England. He was the county captain then, and he quite liked taking the grass off when he came back to Taunton, I think, so he didn't have to bowl too much in between test matches. And at 29, I think probably cricketers are somewhere near their peak, probably. I was quite fit too then, relatively speaking. But yeah, the odd thing was the batting, where everything suddenly clicked. But I mean, I did start my career, I should tell you. I was signed by Somerset as a batsman, not an off spinner. That's how I started as a pro. But then I learnt to bowl adequate off spin at quite a late age, partly through bowling a lot at university, and then being, given more responsibility at Somerset. Bowlers were in shorter, supply than batsmen, so it was quite a good career move in hindsight.
Yeah, I mean, in 1982, and I think by that time, by 1984, you'd already been man of the match in 2 Lord's finals as well, hadn't you? Once when you got 2 for 24, and
1984,
man of the match.
Yeah, 3, I think. No, 2.
You got 2 for 24, virtually identical figures in 2 finals, and you were man of the match in one, but not in the other, when a certain Viv Richards got 130 odd, and I think he just pipped you on that occasion. But you must have had great memories of that. And when Somerset won recently in the last Lord's final, I saw you on the day there, and I know you were very, very pleased and doubtless thinking of past successes there.
Well, we were a good one-day side. We were a better one-day side than championship side in those days, partly because I think it's easier to win one-day trophies. The championship is a slog. And I suppose some of our, the great players, they could raise their game on any given day. Viv was brilliant at that. He would still score a lot of runs in the championship, but nonetheless, he could really turn it on and make sure he played a bit more in a restrained fashion in Lord's finals, because he wanted to leave his stamp and he wanted us to win. So he had a fantastic record in Lord's finals, as did Joel, who never won a man of the match at Lord's, and yet he always ended up with 1, 2, 3, 4 wickets for about 19 or 20. And therefore, it was quite easy to play in those Lord's finals once you got over the initial nerves. The other thing that helped me in those sort of games is that there's more tension, more pressure in a Lord's final, for the batsman especially. And a consequence of that is, if you're bowling like I used to bowl, which is a fairly gentle off spin, is that the batsman has to take the initiative. If you land it in the right place, it's up to them to do something. Now, in a bog standard, I don't know, Sunday League game somewhere out in the sticks, that's not such a problem. But it's a Lord's final, there's cameras there, everything seems to be very, very important. So there's more tension amongst the batsmen. And if you're able, at whatever pace, to keep just landing it and tempting them and frustrating them, they're more likely to make mistakes in a Lord's final. And I think that's why in the last 3 or 4 finals I played in, I was quite successful, because you could prey on people's nerves more with pace off the ball, but landing it in the right place time and time again. And they had to agonize whether to go to the big shot. Whereas, I don't know, at Western-super-Mare, they might just play the big shot, not think about it, and clear the boundary. Yeah. We got better. I mean, we had a good team, obviously. We were so lucky. But we got better at those Lord's finals, more confident. We played very badly in the first one against Sussex, but we sort of learned from that. And we had, we ought to have won things. We had 3 of the best players in the world in our team.
Yeah, yes, 3 of the best players. So it was you plus you and 2 others. That was, Vic.
Well, all right. 4 if you like, Nigel.
And I'm sure members later on will have specific questions to ask about Viv Richards, about Joe Garner, Martin Crowe, Ian Botham. So I won't focus directly on that at the moment. But I did want to have a word about captaincy. You're Oxford University captain in 1976 and 1977, 2 successive years, which was unusual in those days. I imagine it is now, a bit like Kumar Sangakkara having a second year as MCC president, although the circumstances are obviously a bit different. You captain your Perth grade cricket side. I'd like to come back if there's time to that later. You were approached at one point about being captain of Glamorgan. But you were only captain officially, at least. You were vice captain a lot and stepped in of Somerset towards the end of the 1980s, towards the end of your career, and you left quite abruptly from that when you got a good offer as a media tart, as you put it, with the Observer on 1st of January 1990. You write quite emotionally in your book about all this and about the captaincy. You're obviously a good man in a crisis, from what you've just said about Lord's finals. You should really have been captain of Somerset earlier, shouldn't you?
Well, it's not really for me to say, but the short answer is probably yes. But it's an odd one. I greatly enjoyed captaining at Oxford, but you have to understand that the expectations there, in terms of results, was practically non-existent. It was taken for granted that you were going to be on the losing side, but we had a great time, and that was sufficient. And then I first captained Somerset in 1980, when I was 24. And I had Gavaskar. It was the year when the West Indies were touring. And lo and behold, Brian Rose was playing for England. Ian Botham was playing for England. Viv and Joel were playing for the West Indies. And I captained quite a few games when Brian and Ian was away. And I enjoyed that, and we did okay, albeit missing a few key players. And to be honest, for the next sort of few years, I was always the next captain, the heir apparent, without anyone ever absolutely nailing that down. But the assumption was, having captained at Oxford, having captained happily in 1980 and a few other times through the 80s. But it panned out differently for all sorts of reasons. And I would have liked to have captained more when I did get the job. And so I captained lots. I captained Somerset far more often as the club's vice captain than I ever did as the official
Mm.
captain of the club. Vice captain is a difficult position because you've got sort of some responsibility, but you're not in total charge. By definition, you're doing it when key people are away. So it's not necessarily to be recommended. But I was the perennial vice captain until 1988, when Pete Roebuck suddenly gave up. And I suppose, without ever really coherently thinking about it, I just anticipated that at some stage I would captain Somerset, and hopefully some stage before 1988, but it just didn't happen. And there would also have been the perception too, when things started to go wrong in the mid-80s, that I might be too gentle for this post, with so many larger-than-life characters in the dressing room. Hence, when Brian Rose gave up, it was hard not to make Ian Botham captain. We just won the NatWest Trophy. He'd captained every game in that cup run in 1983. And we'd won the final under his captaincy. And he's a good captain on the field, Ian. He knew the game. He also desperately wanted the captaincy to demonstrate that after his England experience, I can do this job. It hurt him the way the England captaincy came to an end. So he wanted to prove that he was a captain, and captaining Somerset might be a way to do that. And then after 2 years, it obviously didn't work. And I sort of expected, therefore, although I had been Ian's vice captain, to succeed Ian. But as I say, being vice captain, you're part of the regime. And Pete Roebuck was made captain, which sort of knocked me back briefly. So I was always, about to be made captain, but it didn't happen until quite late on in the career. That's all. And as a consequence, I wanted to actually do another year at the end, when I was probably getting past my best as a player, just to have a bit more experience of that. But the Observer, who are terrific employers, said, actually, it's either now or we can't hold it for you. So there's your resume as far as it goes. But it's a long time ago now. Wake up, Nigel. I've lost Nigel. This is a minor tragedy.
Yes, sorry, I don't know where Nigel's gone.
He might be asleep, it's possible. It's possible I've sent Nigel to sleep.
Well, obviously, maybe his internet connection has gone down. This is the one thing we hoped wouldn't happen.
Okay. Okay. Well, either you're going to ask me a question, Nick, or hang on. Something's burped there, but on my phone. But I still can't see Nigel or hear him. Are you there, Nick?
I am here. Sorry. Yeah, I was just waiting to see if I've got a message. No, that's from my daughter. We could open it up to questions from the floor.
Yeah. Well, let's do that,
Nigel. So I know Bill Allen has got a question.
Okay.
So I'm gonna.
I've got Bill on my screen. Actually, I've only got a little screen. Go for it, Bill.
Hello, Vic. So far, so good. A question really about county cricket. With the resumption of county cricket next month, a small group of enthusiasts are planning a campaign to support and promote cricket, rather as CAMRA did with Real Ale. Our aim is to protect Test and county cricket, saving traditional cricket for men and women. I wonder how much enthusiasm you think might exist within the Cricket Society, and for that matter, within the cricketing world, the press, the commentators, and individuals who believe in it. We need supporters. We'd like to find a young, dynamic leader, but we've already got a framework in place, and we aim to launch in due course. So what are your thoughts about that?
Well, I'm sympathetic. This is not County Cricket Matters, is it? It's something else.
It's really, no, it's not County Cricket Matters. This is a small group who've been thinking along the lines that the dangers are that cricket's getting, particularly county cricket, is getting marginalised. The cricket matches are no longer happening in the peak time of the year. You're getting cricket in October and March, and let's face it, county cricket is the bedrock to the formation of proper cricket and proper players.
Yeah. Well, I have very much sympathy with where you're coming from, because I think county cricket is maligned generally anyway. You get fed up with reading articles that talk about two men and a dog attending county cricket, which is erroneous. It depends, of course, where you are, but down at Taunton, there'll be 2,000 or 3,000, and that's a crowd, and that works down there. Scarborough is practically sold out. Even at places like the Oval, huge stadium, but they get good crowds, and people don't recognise how many people are physically there. But then there is swathes of people around the country who are interested, who are following closely. Increasingly, we'll be doing it tomorrow onwards. I suspect you'll be watching your streaming going on. The crunch probably in all this, and it applies when we talk about Test cricket vis-a-vis one-day cricket, is where the players are coming from. And that's where I get some encouragement, actually. Certainly at the highest level, you talk to the top players, they cherish the longer form of the game. Virat Kohli cherishes it. Jos Buttler, one of the best one-day players we've ever had, is struggling like fury to master Test cricket. He valued his Test century as the highlight of his cricket career. So I think it's very important to keep the players on side, and I think by and large, at the moment, the best players are. I worry what might happen. I'm, as you probably may know, I'm not a keen supporter of the 100. Not so much because I don't like the format, although I don't like the format much, but because it really does make the English domestic season so unbalanced.
Yes.
With the prime months in the middle of the summer being given to the Blast and then to the 100, and relegating county cricket even more to the bookends of the summer. And we have to recognise that Test cricket in England has been the breadwinner, actually, and to get a good Test team and to maintain the interests of a surprisingly large chunk of the public, although they're not always visible, we need to have a good Test side, and we need to flourish at Test level. So I also see when I go around, I know I come to Taunton, but it is very much part of the community down there, as I think it is, say, at Chelmsford and Hove, some of the smaller grounds. It is very much part of the community that brings a lot of people together. So I'm sort of with you. I'm too old to be in your leadership team, however.
No, I agree. I'm too old as well. I'm not going to lead this, but we do need somebody along those lines, and I hope we can find them. And you're quite right about places like Chelmsford. You go to a county match at Chelmsford, there's always a buzz. There's a lot of people there. And Essex have been running a series of decades and bringing in old players. And they all say the main cricket that they most enjoyed was county cricket.
Yeah, it's what you remember.
Yes.
You remember your achievements, really. I mean, the Lord's finals are wonderful, of course. But if you win the championship, as Essex keep doing, you've had to work incredibly hard to do it, sometimes on a glamorous, damp Tuesday in Derby or whatever it is. Yeah. And that's what they remember. And Essex was special. I remember being struck, I don't think it was on the last visit to South Africa, but perhaps the one before, bumping into Ken McEwen, who obviously played for Essex in the sort of late 70s, early 80s.
What a player.
Glorious player. But what struck me was he would travel back every time that there was a sort of get-together of that team. He would travel back from South Africa to join them. I mean, they were a lovely side, a ridiculous side, with the J.K. Levers and your Ackfields and your East and your young Gooch and so forth. But he would always make the effort just to go back for the dinner, because his memories of playing for Essex in that era were so warm. Yeah. And that applies in other counties as well. But Essex were quite special then, and they're not too bad now.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Vic. I hope we can launch this, and I hope people in the Cricket Society will
Yeah,
support
yeah.
what
I
we're
mean, I
doing.
agree with you. There's far more enthusiasm for county cricket than you would recognise if you just sort of read some of the papers.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Bill. And now Nigel is back on the call, so I'm going to hand back to Nigel.
Okay. Are you
Thank
there,
you.
Nigel?
Hi Vic, that was seamless Cricket Society work for you with
I was
Bill.
worried I'd sent you to sleep.
Never. Hearing you mention the 100, there's a memorable phrase in your book which reinforces the fact that you're not too keen on it, because you bracket it with tattoos and referenda as among your least favourite activities. If
Yeah.
I remember correctly.
Yeah, not keen on either of them.
We were talking about captaincy. Just a couple of points. I mean, I noticed yesterday on the radio you said that in your, I think you said, correct me if I'm wrong, that in your 30 years of watching cricket, Ewan Morgan has impressed you as a captain more than anybody else. Did I hear correctly?
What I think I said was that I think that Owen, I mean, I think he's very, very good, but I also think he is almost the most powerful captain over the last, whatever it is, actually I'd go back longer than 30 years, in the sense that, especially at international level, I think, rightly really, within this one-day setup, Owen Morgan is the man in charge. He's won the confidence of all those around him at the ECB level. He's won the confidence of the players. He's kind of been the mastermind. The coach, in this instance here, actually it's Paul Collingwood, but essentially it's Chris Silverwood now, and it was Trevor Bayliss. The coach is quite happy to stand back and let Owen Morgan run the show and dictate who he wants to play, have an input on how they practice and all that. So in that sense, he's earned it. And I mean, one example could well be Alex Hales, not in this squad. There's half a dozen players missing, but Alex Hales not in the squad because there was an issue of trust just before that World Cup. I think Morgan and they're a very close-knit team, this one-day team, when they're all together, the best part. I think Morgan decided that that element of trust was broken then, and he just decided that it's not time to have him back, so he does not come back. So that's what I meant about Morgan, that I think he just runs it, and the coach is even more. It's a fascinating part of the cricket, the coach-captain relationship. The coach is there just to assist him, but Owen Morgan will make the big decisions because he's earned that right, I guess.
Yeah,
and that's unusual. Usually, it's not quite such an obvious sort of balancing act.
Were you captain of your Australian grade side?
No, I don't know where you got that from. No,
your book, if I got it anywhere, but I must have.
Well, no, I'm sure that I would have edited that there. No,
there's a lovely chapter in the book about. You obviously have a great love of Australia for touring both as a player and as a journalist, and you describe in some detail your time with Australian grade cricket. Bayswater Morley, yeah, I've never heard of that before. Johnny Barclay spoke with great.
Well, Johnny, of course, I know he played for Waverley in Sydney, which is where all the rich and famous play.
Yeah,
Boyd's played there as well, actually.
Yeah,
I played for inner city Perth, sort of very unpretentious grade club. All the best ones, all the rich ones, anyway, were along the Swan River or by the coast. I was in an inner city, no nonsense, slightly rough, but absolutely welcoming grade club where my predecessors include Bob Massey, Marcus North, for example, Bruce Reid, and briefly, I think, Tony Locke. Anyway, go on.
I was thinking,
great cricket. I'll go on. I've lost you. Because I don't understand how this. I can't actually see you now.
All right. I can see you. As long as you can hear me, Vic, that's fine. You tell a nice little story about one of your opponents with an unlikely sounding name who had a bit of a problem with his sleeves flapping. Do you remember that? Would you like to share that?
Yeah. Well, grade cricket, it was quite an eye-opener. I went there the first time when I was about 24 or 5 as an innocent, Englishman. And the sledging and the interplay, if you like, between grade cricketers was far worse. I played a summer of Shield cricket, and it was far worse than at Shield level, and certainly far worse than at club level in England or at county level. But this won't make you blush too much. But I just remember playing one game. It was against South Perth, and playing for South Perth was his name was Kim Hagdorn, who subsequently became a journalist working for an evening paper in Perth. And he was one of these. He wasn't quick, but he was a niggly, medium pace, quite skillful bowler, good enough to play the odd game, I think 1 or 2 for West Australia. And you always find that those guys are the ones who have the most to say. Because if you played against, I don't know, the West Indies, Malcolm Marsh, all the quick Michael Holding, they never said a word to you. Didn't need to. Curtly Ambrose. But the medium pacers, dear old Robin Jackman, he never stopped. Paul Allott never stopped. They have to make up for their lack of pace with a few words. And this bloke was no exception. Anyway, one of our team was batting. King Hagdorn was bowling his careful medium pace. Lovely, breezy day. His shirt was flapping. Hagdorn's shirt was flapping. He didn't have his buttons done up. He didn't have his sleeves rolled up, so it was flapping away. And our batsman, understandably, said, "Look, I'm terribly sorry. Could you just..." Could you ask him to do up his button or to stop his sleeve flapping? And Hagdorn, being Hagdorn, he just swiveled round, stared at him, took off his shirt, threw it at the umpire, and said, "All right, if I bowl like this, you'll be all right now." And he did. From one ball at least. He just bowled bare-chested, having abused the batsman for some considerable time. And I thought, that wouldn't have happened in gentle Somerset or indeed Devon, but it sort of thing happened quite often in Perth. However, once you stay there for a while, you kind of got used to it, and they were very welcoming, and I greatly enjoyed my time in Perth. But
good. There's another story that I chuckled at when I reread your book on Kindle this week, and I'd forgotten that you'd tempted Jack Birkinshaw away from Leicestershire for a time. He was coach, was he, at Somerset?
Yeah. I
And
can't remember.
there was a story you told about I think he was an umpire by this time, about when you were bowling against Matthew Maynard and Jack was umpire. Can you share that?
Yeah. Well, Jack was an off spinner and a great coach, actually, but an ultimate cricket man. He played Yorkshire, Leicester, played for England. He umpired at test level, and he was also a terrific coach. I've never known a man who loves the game as much as Jack. When he was umpiring, I used to love bowling at his end because he was an old off spinner, and we'd just chat away, and he'd give me odd little hints, and we'd talk about bowling, and it was just good fun bowling at his end, and also quite informative. Anyway, I'm bowling away at Cardiff in the mid-80s, I guess, and I get a wicket. And the new man is Matthew Maynard, who's only just started, maybe first season. I'd never seen him play, so I said, "Well, who's this bloke coming out then, Jack?" And he told me, Matthew Maynard. He said, and I'll tell you what he said, he can play. He can hit the ball. Oh, I said, and he then went on to say, but he's pretty impetuous. He could do anything. So if I were you, I'd just bowl a couple little flat ones, keep them quiet, and then toss one up in the air, and anything could happen. So I took note of that, and I continued bowling, and I did exactly as Jack said. I bowled 2 flat ones, which he just played, and I tossed one up in the air, and he ran past it and was stumped for naught. And I swiveled round, and I said, "Well done, Jack, well done," I said, without remembering that actually the captain of Glamorgan, who was Rodney Ontong at the time, was a non-striker. So it was not quite appropriate. But it was a reflection, maybe, of, it still applies a bit, I think, of the relationship you'd have with those umpires at first. Like, they're all ex-players. You kind of got alongside them, and they were happy to give some advice or to just chat about the game. And Jack, that's probably why I signed him as Somerset coach back in '89. I remember talking to him. He was in Bunbury at the time, south of Perth, and he came to us for, I think, I left him after one season, but he was at Somerset for 3 or 4 years, and then he got enticed back to Leicester. But he was a fine coach. He's coached the England women since. I saw him last year or the year before. He's still nearly 80, and he's working for the ECB as a sort of spin guru. He was chatting to some young spinners, and he is the smiliest Yorkshireman I ever come across.
Yes, he's a great guy, and it's interesting that it's off spinners off break bowlers like you and Johnny Barclay who have the most memorable conversations with umpires. It seems to me, perhaps because you're not staring in.
I mean, it was in your interest actually, but without wanting to be too cynical about this. But you wanted to build up a good rapport with the umpires. We didn't have many things on our side, little gentle off spinners, so you wanted to get the umpires on the side, so you might get the odd marginal LBW decision.
Yeah.
Well, I remember there was one umpire way back called David Halfyard, who also played for Kent and Notts, was a fine bowler. And he ended up bowling sort of leg breaks and leg cutters. And quite a brusque sort of character, who I played with at club level briefly in Devon afterwards. But I remember bowling at his end on quite a helpful pitch. And after a few overs, I'd go back up there and toss him a jumper, and he looked at me. He said, "I don't know what you're doing." He said, "I'd have bowled him out by now." They were only 5 down. But you had that rapport with umpires, and I hopefully it still applies, though you don't spend so much time in their company now. I mean, at county level in the 80s, it was commonplace. You'd always have a drink or two after the game with opposition, and the umpires would be there as well. And they had, a lot of umpires. They had terrific cricket brains to pick, and you were all part of the same sort of circus, really. And you tried to build up a good rapport with them. I mean, Sam Kilk gave me some ridiculous LBWs, but I must have brought him a few beers before that.
Great, Vic. Thank you for all that. One final question from me before Nick has a very short break, poses a couple of questions, and then we bring in other members with questions. It's really about your writing plans and your book of the year experience. Famously, you had to write this book so that you could get out of our judging panel for book of the year. I wondered. Stephen Fay was a well-known journalist who died earlier this year. I wondered whether you could say a word or two about him and anything you're able to tell us about your future book writing plans. Not another 35 years, I hope. Otherwise, we might be in the Zoomogram from the King territory.
Well, Stephen Fay, he was affectionately known, as you probably know, as Captain Claret, which sort of suited him well. And he was part of this very carefully selected by you judging team. And there was we had some good fun doing the tricky business of judging. But Stephen, David Kynaston, for example, they were ideal choices because their knowledge of cricket was immense, but also their knowledge of writing and editing. And Stephen was politely scathing about, some quite good books it would have been a great book had there been a decent editor around, for example. He would give a strong opinion in an extremely genteel, polite manner. I mean, I remember he was a business journalist, essentially, who came over to his great love of cricket very late in his career. And I do remember him coming on an Ashes tour back in the 90s. It was the Ashes tour when Shane Warne was, I think, injured. And in the first test match, got to the 5th day at Brisbane. And England was set a big target, way over 300, but they had about 8 wickets remaining at the start of play. And there was this potential for heavy rain, though, in the afternoon. I remember getting into a cab with Stephen, and he was such a romantic in this regard. He said, "Oh, I hope it doesn't rain. I hope it doesn't rain. It could be a great day." I said, "Stephen, if you're an England supporter, you've just got to pray for that rain because there's no way England will win." And as it happened, we got the most biblical thunderstorm. which finished the game off and saved England around about 2 o'clock in the afternoon. So he's a great romantic in one way, but a very good journalist, great fun to be with, wonderful sense of humour, and a very good judge of what was good writing. He's edited one of the Wisdom magazines as well. So sadly missed. But going back to that judging experience, I'm glad it's over now. But I enjoyed it hugely, partly because Nigel there organised everything superbly, have a lot of fun going through some of the books. And I think the whole process, and I went to the dinner after I finished, and Rob Winder just hosted it brilliantly. It was great. So it's a pity that Lord's evening can't happen at the moment, but I'm sure it'll come back. And it's it's a very popular event. It's hard work sometimes to read. There are some good cricket books out there, but there are some not so good. And of course, as our beautiful judges, we read them all, and sometimes that was quite hard work. Anyway, there we go.
And you're on the short list, Vic, for this year's award, which will be a Zoomable event in the autumn.
Okay.
We think, although we might have a small session, we're not quite sure yet. MCC staff are still in furlough. And your writing plans?
Well, I have agreed. This was a consequence of lockdown with people who published the original spin, Allen and Unwin. During the start of lockdown, I had all these grand ideas that I might as well do some more writing. And I started writing it's more like a collection of essays, I think, not that interconnected. So I probably wrote, 30,000 words worth. So I thought I'll get in touch and see whether that can be turned into a book. And in principle, that is going to happen. But I've got a bit of work to do between now and Christmas to get it together. But you may have available another tome, this time next year, if all goes to plan. But I can't tell you exactly what's going to be in it, partly to sustain your interest, but partly because I haven't a clue.
Well, thank you very much for that. That's sort of the end of the first part of the session then. So on behalf of the 89 participants plus a few, we're in the 90s now. We're nearly at 100, Vic. There's rather more people than were at Southampton in the crowd yesterday, I imagine. So on behalf of those 89 plus people, thank you so much for the first half of this session, and over to Nick. Thank you.
Cheers, Nigel.
Thank you, Vic. Thank you, Nigel. So first of all, I'm just going to ask you a few questions. It will take 2 seconds. It's anonymous, so if you were able to answer the poll, that would be very helpful. So I'm going to put that on the screen now. And then I'm going to go to, while you're pondering those, see whether we can get Chris Coleman on the line, because he has a question for you. Just trying to find where Chris is. Oh, he seems to have disappeared. Hang on a sec. Well, I can't.
Can you hear me?
Oh, Chris, brilliant.
Hey, it's Chris Coleman speaking from Cheltenham Cricket Society, Vic.
Hello.
Very entertaining speech thus far, as always. My question is that I first saw you play in the 70s at Chippenham for the Somerset second team, and realised you were big mates with Peter Roebuck, who at the time was hitting the Wiltshire fast bowler into the gardens next door.
Savage.
That's it. And I obviously realised that you had a fairly close relationship with Peter Roebuck, both as a cricketer and as a man. And I thought it would be interesting to hear what you could say about him, please.
Well, where to start there? I mean, Pete and I joined on the same day. We ended up, I played actually under his captaincy for England public schools under 15s. And we played at Liverpool against ESCA, England Schools Cricket Association, who chose their team from sides from the north, west, east and south. They'd had a week of cricket beforehand, and we always remember the fact that the team that was picked by ESCA to play against these public schools had I.T. Botham as the 13th man. And once told of this, Both headed straight for the West Country. He was not going to have any truck with being 13th man. And then, so Pete and I, we shared rooms together for years. We drove to got lost together on the roads before all the motorways, and shared constant meals together on tour. So we became very close friends. Obviously, and he was a gutsy cricketer, I can tell you that. And many worse cricketers have played for England. And then, of course, inevitably, I can't see anyone at the moment, but I don't suppose that matters. I don't know if you can see me.
You're frozen, Vic.
I'm frozen.
Holding your water.
Oh, right. I have frozen then. I don't know why.
We can hear you, though. We can hear you. So.
Okay, I'll keep going. And I'm back, I think. And then obviously everyone asks about, when everything went sour at Somerset. I always like to point out that we joined in 1974, and the relationship between Ian and Pete between, say, 1974 and way into the 80s was actually a very good one. They were completely contrasting, but they got on well. They took the mickey out of one another. They were intrigued by one another. One, had a fantastic brain, and Both was Both. So it's always a mistake to think that this was a long-standing sort of feud between Botham and Roebuck. It went sour in the mid-80s, partly over the captaincy issues, because Pete didn't think Both should be captain. And then partly when Pete himself became captain, it kind of became untenable. But I always like to point out that this was not a lifelong feud, although post-1986, with the sacking of Viv, Joel, the relationship between him and Ian was non-existent, and likewise with Viv, really. But Pete, so I was always the man in between, really, possibly the only one talking to both parties at some point to no great effect. But Pete, I always liked, we had some great times. And Pete, in the end, the image you had of Pete was one of a sort of tortured, constantly tortured soul. Whereas in his 20s, he was sometimes tortured, but he was sometimes hilarious, and he was sometimes very capable of laughing at himself and the agonies he went through trying to play cricket. I don't know whether you've read It Never Rains, which was his diary of a season. Well, it's a terrific book, but there's a bit of agonizing going on, but there's also a bit of self-deprecating humor as far as he's concerned. And I was annoyed with him when he died, and because I don't know whether he did. The assumption is that he threw himself off the balcony. I thought, well, why did you do that? He didn't reach out for help easily, and maybe we didn't give him enough help. But I was sort of kind of annoyed with him at that stage. But we had grown a bit apart because he spent all his time in Australia then, and we didn't see so much of him. So it's a curious relationship. He was my best man, so we were very close for quite a long time, and then as things sometimes happen, we drifted apart. Certainly a little bit over the 86 issue, where we were not in agreement about how things were going to go about sacking the West Indians. But more significantly, when Pete moved to Australia permanently, that he became a more distant figure. I've rambled.
No, thank you, Vic. That's great. I'm going to ask John G. He has a question for you. John G.
Hello, Vic. I very much enjoyed reading your book. Nothing to do with that, but one of the commentators on TMS, I don't think it was you, said that I think it was Tuffers actually, said that he felt England needed to find a role for Geoff Arch. I mean, his bowling, really, I think, was overshadowed by Wokes and Broad in the last test. I just wondered your views on that.
Well, I think it is imperative for England to keep Jofra Archer in the fold, definitely. And I think they all think, and I think that, he is raw. He is occasionally frustrating. What we all have to recognize is that fast bowlers, especially, we want them to bowl at 90 miles an hour all the time. And we're puzzled when they don't. But if you ask fast bowlers about this, they kind of understand that, just some days the rhythm is there and some days it's not. So he can exasperate because we see the lethal spells where suddenly he generates pace and bounce from nowhere. And then he can get the best players out from Steve Smith downwards. But some days it doesn't quite work. So I think we have to be patient there. And the notion will be that he will be potential gold dust in Australia, where after a certain period of time, the wickets get flat, the ball doesn't go sideways, but extra pace can be invaluable. So they want to have him there. There was one spell in the series where it clicked and he got wickets, and he even at Old Trafford he produced a brute of a ball, but he hasn't had this flurry of wickets that we saw last summer. So, Archer has got to be in the fold, and that's what they think. I'm just wondering what they'll do when we get to the next Test match. You would assume that if Stokes is fully fit and able to bowl, they will drop a bowler, with Stokes resuming as the fourth seamer. And I suppose Archer may be the man to go, although I think in their perfect balance, they like a variety. So they like the idea of one of Archer or Wood to provide that extra pace when the wicket's sleeping and nothing is happening. So you've got all sorts of different options. However, I don't know what will happen at Old Trafford coming up, but they could easily go Wokes, Anderson, Broad, Stokes, plus a spinner. But what they will and should continue doing is this rotation. I know it sounds ugly, but one reason we won that series quite easily against West Indies in the end was that our bowlers were always fresh, and no English pace bowler bowled in more than 2 matches, and it showed. And they will persist with that. Obviously, when you get to those key games, you want to pick what you reckon to be your best team. But when you're playing 6 tests in 7 weeks, the idea of rotating is almost compulsory. And I suspect that none of them will play more than, say, 4 out of the 6. And they are sufficiently good for us to be able to do that, I think. So Archer, you've got to support him. You've got to stick with him because he could help win us an Ashes series, I think.
Thank you. So now I'm going to ask Peter West if he can come with his question.
Oh, hello, Vic.
Hello.
Speaking as a Hampshire member, we heard you on Test Match Special extolling the virtues of Viv Richards, and rightly so. But how would you compare him with his equally great namesake, Barry Richards?
Well, I did play a little bit against Barry Richards, and it's a strange comparison to make. I mean, it is. We always say that Viv was the best of his era, but then he had scope to be the best of his era. He was just a bit younger than Barry Richards, but Barry Richards didn't have the canvas on which to perform. I mean, Barry Richards was sublime and technically probably more orthodox, but capable of improvising from there. The one comparison I suppose you would make in Viv's favour was, curiously, his sort of durability. Viv kept playing well for an awfully long time. When Barry played for Hampshire, he could be sublime, or he could be exasperatingly careless, I think, because he got bored. It wasn't enough of a challenge. They always used to say that when his parents came over to watch him, play for Hampshire, he would probably get 4 centuries in a week or two because he was motivated. I mean, it's not a good example, but I always remember I played at Scarborough once, and it was it was a sort of Brian Close 11 versus Hampshire Scarborough Festival. So it was not a vitally important fixture, but I always remember Richards coming out to bat on the first evening, and they had about 60 minutes to bat, possibly, Hampshire. And for about half an hour, he played beautifully and probably got 30 in no time. And then for the next half hour, all he was trying to do was get out because he didn't want to turn up on time the nex day. It was rather embarrassing because we couldn't bowl straight or we dropped catches, and he just managed it with a few minutes to spare. But you could tell that he was, he'd had his little knock and he wanted to ensure that he didn't have to turn up promptly the next day. So, and I think there are moments of, I don't know, you'll probably remember better than me, of his Hampshire career where he kind of drifted off. But that's because I suppose the challenge wasn't sufficient. But I think he regrets that a little bit. So, I mean, I didn't see that much of him, so I can't really compare. But I always go with Viv because he kept doing it for year in, year out. But he was a genius, clearly. Barry Richards and Barry Reid, the 2 Barrys used to open for Hampshire. Quite a contrast.
Well, they were both great batsmen, certainly.
Yeah.
Phil Veazey, can you unmute yourself, or Phil's got a question?
Thank you, Nick. Good afternoon, Mr. Marks. Thank you for a very entertaining afternoon. My question is about cricket societies, actually. You have spoken at the Leicestershire Cricket Society, which I had the honour to be on the committee of, and you are destined to speak again in March of next year. My question to you, do you think, obviously depending on the size of the venue, that cricket societies are going to be able to meet again? You may remember you spoke to us in the Charles Palmer, which is quite a large auditorium. We have space at Grace Road. Many other cricket societies meet in smaller venues. And as a speaker, do you foresee that cricket societies will be able to meet again? Thank you.
Well, it's almost beyond my understanding. I mean, it's a medical sort of health and safety issue, isn't it? And I guess it's a question of timing. One has to hope that we will return to some sort of normality at some point. And there'll be an awful lot of cricket societies, cricket clubs who are desperate to get together and chat about the game again. But come next March, I don't know. You'll have to ask Boris and co. Idea. You won't know, and if he tells you, you won't know whether it's going to be right.
No, indeed.
I mean, I think there'll be. I actually bumped into an old Leicestershire cricketer, I think, Charlie Dagnall, who's here at Southampton. He played briefly for Leicester.
You know, Charles, I had the honour to be upstairs when he was in the dressing room.
Right, and well, I mean, not seeking sympathy for Charlie, but he's now a freelance operator, and he does a lot of work at cricket functions, hosting them, and he does it brilliantly, and speaking at them sometimes, and all that sort of thing, as well as doing some media stuff. And so he chose, of course, the worst possible time to go freelance, because he said he had 10 events that he was going to attend cancelled in the space of 2.5 minutes back in March. So it's a great sadness for someone like Charlie, who needs to be sort of comparing, if you like, big cricket events. But it's also a great for all the cricket lovers out there. I suspect, although Nigel and Nick will be possibly even more sophisticated, if you could, going on amongst cricket societies or all sorts of groups as a fail-safe, and occasionally as something that might happen in normal times, because no one has to go anywhere, no travelling to be done, and you can still have a good conversation. But to answer your question, I don't know the answer, but let's hope the social distancing is not necessary certainly come next summer, because the clubs will be just desperate to get back to normal. Otherwise, their finances are going to be shredded, let alone the cricket societies. But the county cricket clubs need us to be back to normal come next April, May. And, well, there's no absolute guarantee of that.
Thank you, Vic. Yes, yeah, we're certainly going to be planning more Zoom calls as well as physical meetings if we can get back together. I'm now going to ask Chris Coke. Chris, are you there? Can you unmute yourself, or can I unmute you? Here we go.
Right. This is a humorous question. And the question is, which did you find more challenging, playing with Lord Ian Botham and Sir Vivian Richards, or being on Test Match Special with Sir Geoffrey Boycott?
Right. Well, let's. The simple answer is that, on balance, I think it was more fun playing. I had a bit of trouble adjusting to Sir Ian Botham. And whilst I love Ian dearly, I can't help thinking that the world has gone completely mad to envisage him in his regalia in the House of Lords, presumably deciding how the country operates. But that's one for Nigel from the civil service to sort out, or whoever, I don't know. But the simple answer is, I think in my, proud to have been there list, playing with, actually the great privilege actually was playing with Viv and watching Viv in May 1974, when no one else knew that he was going to be a genius. He came to Somerset completely unknown, barely played a first-class match, if so it was for the Windward Isles or whatever. No one knew what was coming. And that little group of us there, from the very first ball he faced in practice to the very first innings he played at Swansea in the B&H, where he smashed 81 in extraordinary fashion, to the first game against Hampshire, where Andy Roberts charged in and bounced him and he'd hook him off his cap or he'd top edge him over his shoulder. Fantastic theatre. We suddenly realised that we had the first glimpse, before anyone else, of a cricketing genius. And that even trumps trying to broadcast with Sir Geoffrey Boycott. There you go.
Thank you, Vic. I'm now going to ask Alex, who has a question about the Book of the Year award.
Yeah.
Sorry, to answer the guy from earlier, it's very handy with Zoom meetings for the society, because you can do stuff like make your bed, which is what I was just doing.
You can make your bed. I mean, at least my daughter's been doing some remote teaching, and she's complained about a lot of unmade beds from her students. But anyway, carry on.
As an amazing chair of the judges of the prestigious Book of the Year award, what book from your time judging would stand out as the best read to fulfill the days we can't get into cricket grounds?
All right. Well, let's see. Nigel will have a view on this wherever he's gone, if he's still awake. I don't know. I mean, I can remember my first year as well as any of them. And we had a curious choice to make, which was between the book about Alan Gibson of Didcot and the Demon, and the book about Kim Hughes, I think Golden Boy is called, I think. And they were so contrasting. in the end, we gave it to the Gibson book, which had been written by his son, but it was also a collection of the writings of the great Alan Gibson. But Anthony had collated it and written beautifully about his father as well at the start of every section. And in the end, we ended up giving it the prize to the Gibson book. In part, I think, because one of the judges, I remember, and he wasn't a judge for long during the time we were doing it, we had to rank them. We always rank the books. Say we've got 20, we give Nigel a ranking from 1 to 20, from which a shortlist emerges. And most of us had thought Golden Boy by Christian Ryan was certainly in our top 6 comfortably, except for one of Judge who put it right down the bottom. I think because there were described some sort of scenes not so distant from those in Women in Love, described by where there was sort of a wrestling going on between Dennis Lilly and Kim Hughes somewhere in some showers somewhere. And he just couldn't abide this. But that was that Golden Boy was a terrific book about not just Kim Hughes, but about the Australian setup post-Packer and all the strains and stresses that came out of that Packer series. Hence, Kim Hughes was the Golden Boy who ended up captaining the likes of Rod Marsh and Dennis Lilly, who of course Packer men, and all the strains and stresses and the peculiar relationships. And it was extremely well researched on the one hand, but the 3 people who didn't talk to Christian Ryan was Lilly, Kim Hughes, and I think Rod Marsh. But I keep getting told also by my publisher that was a brilliant book. How could it possibly not win? But Anthony Gibson's book was pretty damn good as well. So that's, you often remember the first one more than the others, but I think that one sticks in my mind. I don't know. You ought to talk to Nigel about that as well, because although technically he doesn't have a vote, he's in charge.
It's a very good book, and so is Christian Ryan's one on Patrick Eager, even better.
Yeah,
in a way.
Yeah. Well, that I think his books tend to split opinion.
Yeah,
the same sort of thing applied with the book with Patrick Eager, in that some people thought it was just fantastic and put it down as their number 1, and some people were really unimpressed by it for all sorts of reasons, partly because actually in that book they didn't like the quality of the photographs, that they were frustrated by that, but he is he divides opinion, I think, Christian Ryan, but for some people, and I think I'm on the applauding side of it, he writes brilliantly and surprisingly as well.
Right, I'm going to move on to so I think we've probably got one more question. I'm not sure, Nigel, but I think we aim for an hour and a half. So one more question from Roger Cooper, and then I'm going to ask Bill Allen to do the vote of thanks. Roger, are you able to unmute yourself?
Has that worked?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. Yeah, thanks, Vic, for the talk today. I understand that there were quite a few personal battles, what you might call alpha male battles, I guess, between Mike Proctor and Ian Botham in the day. What do you remember about that? I think there was single wicket competition, there was golf. I know that Mike Proctor came out on top until...
Well, they were too pleased.
Until Ian Botham decided it should be clay pigeon shooting, was the story I heard. So what do you remember about that?
Well, that might well be true. I'm just trying to remember. They were sort of peas from the same pod, really, in the sense that they lived life and they enjoyed one's company. They were in a bar, come what may, together afterwards, and they, both very competitive. Procky was a bit older than Both, so that when Both started, he was very much the sort of junior man there, and Procky was already well established at Proctorshire. But I think they gelled fairly quickly. So they had a very good relationship. It was a very friendly rivalry, I think, but full-blooded on the field. I mean, on the same tack, I remember on a tour of Australia, 82-3, he had that sort of rivalry a bit with Dennis Lilly, which was they tried to exploit commercially. And I remember they had a trotting race. You know, they do the trots in Australia where they've got this fragile little sort of wagon, and you've got the riders there, like the jockeys and the horses tearing off. Well, neither Dennis nor Ian had really ever done this, but they set up a trotting race and gave them a couple nags to drive. And on that score, it seemed like Ian was a bit madder than Dennis, took more risks, and therefore won that ridiculous duel around a trotting track somewhere in Perth, I think. I mean, Ian got on well with just about everyone in international cricket. I mean, we talk about, I think that's one reason why they got the Richards Botham Trophy, is partly because those two ensured that whatever else was happening in that time between England and West Indies, the relationships between the two sides was excellent. So yeah, Both was the only person who failed miserably to get on with Both, and Both is to be blamed for this as well, is someone who you thought he would be in bosom pals with, and that, of course, was Ian, and still is, Ian Chappell. You'd think they should be great mates, but they never will be. They're too obstinate.
Thanks, Vic. So I'm going to ask Bill Allen now to propose the vote of thanks.
Thank you, Nick, and thank you, Vic. Many of you will know I'm a great lover of that jazz man, Ronnie Scott. And he used to say, when I want your opinion, I'll give it to you. And I think Vic today has given his opinion, as he does masterfully in The Guardian and The Observer, and as usual, thoughtfully and well-reasoned, with gentle wit. We know his experience with the Cricket Society as Vice President, and he's told us about Book of the Year. I'd like to remind Vic that this August is the 38th anniversary of your Test debut. It was against Pakistan, who of course start the tests here soon. I thought we'd get through the afternoon. I'm very surprised we got through the afternoon without that famous quote of you, Vic. At any time, somewhere in the world, someone is hitting Vic Marks for 6.
We nearly did it.
I wasn't going to allow it to end. So I just want to continue to say thank you for all your thoughts and your support for the idea of a camera of cricket. And can we thank Vic in the usual manner?
Thank you very much. I hope Nigel's still there. I've lost him. Bye-bye.
Everybody.
Goodbye, everyone.
Bye.
Thanks, everybody.